Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, a Northside numbers game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. Thanks for being here today. I know you have a lot of choices. You can find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. If you can, please take a second and drop a rating or review on Apple, Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you could share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds can help me get better and help other Cub fans find the show. You can also help support the CubsPS Plus podcast by going to cubspsplus.patreon.com. There are 4 support tiers that come with added perks, and your support will help me keep this podcast ad-free. Welcome into episode 48. The Rick Rushell episode of this podcast. Who wore number 48 the first time I ever experienced the Cubs in contention back in 1984. What a great year that was. Right now, Cubs baseball is all about increasing the sense of urgency. The buffer the Cubs have to just let guys not perform while they figure things out is pretty much gone. Seiya Suzuki has found the bench a lot more often, Patrick Wisdom's playing time is way down, and the Cubs are getting a big boost from some unexpected guys, like in particular Mike Tauchman. This week I talk about that increasing sense of urgency and what it's going to mean for the Cubs as they continue to fight for a potential spot in the postseason. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. What a difference a year can make. Right now the Cubs sit at 59 and 56 heading into a series against the Toronto Blue Jays up in Toronto this weekend. Last year at this time the Cubs were 45 and 65, going nowhere. They had just made some trades but didn't trade the guys they expected to deal with the deadline. And it was right around this time last year that the Cubs announced that Jason Hayward would not be returning to action last season and would be let go for this season. So there was the sort of the beginning of, I guess, a bit of a sense of urgency. So one thing that I want to talk about this week, the last 2 years when the Cubs have been playing but not really playing for anything, there's not a lot of urgency. So I remember last year seeing a lot of Twitter and social media and other discussion about, man, what are the Cubs doing with this bullpen move or that bullpen move, or why didn't they go to this guy in the 9th? It didn't matter. They were just trying things out. They had guys they wanted to see if guys were dudes. That's why Frank Schwindel played so much last year. They toyed around with Brandon Hughes closing. They had Mark Leiter Jr. in the pen in a bunch of different roles. They tried out the closer role in a number of different guys. It just really didn't matter. Like they were trying to line things up. They were taking a shot. Hopefully some guys stuck. But it didn't really matter if they won that game. And then coming into this year, there's kind of an increasing sense of urgency as the season goes along. You start, opening day. You want to win opening day. You want to get off to a good start. But it's the first of 162. It's not a must-win game. You can lose opening day and recover. Now, this year the Cubs won opening day, but throughout the season I've seen a lot of sentiment from fans about, wow, this is a must-win game. We've got to finish the sweep on this series, or we've got to win this series. And I feel it, and it matters, and certainly you can't have that many must-win games, but you have to win some of them. I mean, you can't get to game 115 where the Cubs are now, or 116, and not have won any of them. But each individual game, the Cubs have missed opportunities. We've talked about it on this podcast. The Cubs, got swept by Miami and went in and lost 3 out of 4 to the Nationals. It was a huge missed opportunity. I mean, it turns out the Marlins are pretty good this year, but still, that's a huge missed opportunity, and those are games you have to make up later. So when the Cubs right now are sitting a couple games out of the wild card or a couple games out of the division, you can look back on that losing 5 out of 6 stretch and think, man, if we'd won 2, 3 of those games, all of a sudden, we're right there with the division lead right now. On the flip side, though, the Cubs have won series against Baltimore. They beat Tampa Bay 2 out of 3. They just last weekend beat the Braves 2 out of 3. They've had really good series against good baseball teams. So that sense of this one individual game is one we absolutely have to win, just isn't reality. But as the season goes, there was an increase in urgency heading into the trade deadline. The Cubs were in a position where it looked like they could go either way, be buyers, be sellers, and it went down. I talked about that last week. It went down to the last couple weeks to push the front office to make their decision, and they made the decision to buy. And there have been a couple pieces out. There was a good one on Cubs Insider by Evan Altman today that I saw talking about how the Cubs sort of bullied the front office into buying. Now, I don't know that they necessarily had to bully the front office into buying. I think Jed always did. I mean, people have talked throughout the year about this team was designed to sell. It wasn't designed to sell. It was designed to try to compete. I could argue they didn't do enough. But if they were designed to sell, they don't extend Nico Happ in the first month of the season. They were designed to put together a team to kind of tide things over until more prospects come up, and do so in such a way that if things didn't go well, then you had pieces you could sell. I think it's a big difference. It's not nearly the same as being all in or having that sort of urgency from the offseason forward. But they made good strides, and we're seeing that now. You know, last year at this point, I already said the Cubs were 45-65. They didn't win their 59th game until September 12th, when ironically they beat the Mets and Pete Alonso did not homer. How the hell did that happen? Maybe the Cubs didn't pitch to Pete Alonso that day, but he went 1 for 4 with no RBIs, no bombs, which would have been really nice this week. But we won't spend too much time talking about the Mets. It was a rough series. The Cubs got blown out in game 1. I suppose that's somewhat predictable. They had the big series against Atlanta over the weekend. Then you travel, play a night game in New York. New York jumped them 10-2. Wasn't good. I'm not even going to say it was fine, but you know, sometimes those things happen. And I think it was another example of having that urgency. You know, that was kind of the last straw for Drew Smyly in the starting rotation. The Cubs announced this week that he's going to be going to the bullpen, and it's been a while coming, and I understand the desire to keep him in. I mean, to start the season, he was super, super hot. And we're going to get more into pitcher workloads later, but you know, he got off to a really good start and just really kind of struggled for a while. And I know it's a little bit difficult right now with Stroman being hurt, but I think sending him to the pen is sort of the only move. But that is kind of what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about that sense of urgency. You know, once you're competing, once you decide you're in, and the Cubs decide they're in, they didn't go all in. They didn't trade for Shohei Ohtani. They didn't sell their top 5 prospects for, you know, veteran arms. We'll get into it later. I kind of wish they would have done a little bit more in the relief front to shore up the bullpen, but they're in. They didn't bail. They didn't subtract anything from this team at the trade deadline, and that matters. You know, the last time the Cubs played meaningful baseball this late in the season was 2019, and I'll drop the COVID season out because it was only 60 games long and it was a weird season. But the last normal season where they played meaningful baseball was 4 years ago. It was 2019. The Cubs were 3.5 games up on August 8th. They were last in first place on August 22nd. And they were really hanging right around there with the Cardinals and the Brewers until September 17th, when they were 2 games behind the Cardinals, and that started a 7-game losing streak. They wound up finishing 84-78, 5 games out of the division and 7 games back of the wild card. Sorry, that's backwards. 5 games out of the wild card, 7 games out of the division. And that season, that ending sucked. I mean, that was the infamous, the offense is broken season. That was when Javi Baez got hurt late in the season and Nico Horner had to come up and make a debut after his AA season that had already ended. It was good to see him up there at that point, but you know, the Cubs didn't get it done. They lost some big games in St. Louis to end the year. And it was just a kind of a painful way to go out. And really, that was probably, even though they had the division championship in 2020, that year was so weird. That 2019 season was probably really the sort of the end of the old core, at least the end of their run of success. And so now the last 2 years, you know, the Cubs have been sellers and playing, frankly, meaningless baseball at the end of the season. I don't know how you watch baseball and everybody, you know, roots for the team in their own way, but I'm somebody who, I follow the results daily. Obviously now I have a podcast, so I follow it in a different way than I used to. But when the Cubs are good, I want to watch every game. I don't want to skip to the end. I don't want to see the score and go back and watch highlights. I want to watch as many of the games as possible because I love that pitch to pitch, the inning to inning, the batter to batter drama of it all. I want to feel that feeling that, you know, they're down 2 runs in the 7th, but they've had a bunch of good at-bats today, and I'm fairly confident that they have a good chance to make a rally late. And I want to see if they do it. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. You know, I really enjoyed the game against the Mets on Wednesday. I was fully confident the Cubs were going to win that game. And they made the rally. Seiya got the home run. They got the guys on base. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but the bunt decision with Madrigal, personally, I'm a 50-50 there. I'm not a bunt guy. I think 95% of the time you don't want to give up the out. Giving up the out is the loser play. That's kind of the one scenario, though, and with Madrigal up to bat, or Madrigal pinch hitting for Amaya, that I think Amaya is a pretty solid double play candidate. And with Madrigal, he doesn't hit into a ton of double plays, but he does hit the ball on the ground a lot. And so when he came up, I thought it was kind of a 50-50 decision, bunt or not bunt. I wouldn't have been mad either way. I thought it was a perfectly defensible decision to bunt. Madrigal's a guy who can bunt. And, if you really look at the scoring probability numbers, it's about 63% likely to score when you're first and second, nobody out. And at second and third, one out, the probability actually goes up to 68%. So that's one of those few times where even taking the out and moving the runners along does statistically help you. I know there was a lot of criticism over the decision because Christopher Morel and Ian Happ are big strikeout guys, but they did have Nico Horner lined up in between. And, Morel just had a bad at bat. He does that sometimes. He's a young player. He's learning. He's had a couple of those lately, and that's something where, he got down 2 strikes with, the pitcher going for the top of the zone. It's a strikeout pitcher against Morel, which is a potentially inherent K matchup. But strike 3 was a fastball right down the middle. It's pretty clear that Morel was guessing at something. He was looking for some sort of off-speed pitch, didn't get it, and got locked up on the fastball. It happened. It's unfortunate. It's something the team can still recover from. That was not a... It was a loss that didn't help anything, for sure. And there are no good losses at this point in the season. But that's not a catastrophic one. But even then, so then there's 2 outs and Nico Horner's up. And the Mets, of course, were going to probably pitch around Nico Horner, which they did. And I brought up Happ. And, Happ, kind of uncharacteristically, I think he was just trying to be aggressive to drive the run in. But he swung at some pitches high and out of the zone, fouled a couple off, and then wound up striking out. And so that's how that game ended. It's disappointing, and the guys have to execute, but I don't really put it on the bunt decision. I think if you're putting that much attention on the bunt decision, I would raise some other larger questions, like why did the Cubs continue to pitch to Pete Alonso all series? He drove in more runs in the series at 10 than the Cubs scored 8 the entire series. The Cubs just kept going after him, and Hendricks had a really good at bat against him. I think it was the 5th with the bases loaded. There was nowhere to put him, so he had to pitch to him and got the ground ball out to end the inning. But there was, I don't know, pitch around him more early in the game. He's clearly hot. He kills the Cubs in general. So I don't know, that and the inability to score against those Mets pitchers more than 2 runs before the 9th inning, I think those are way bigger problems or things to second guess than whether or not Nick Madrigal bunted in the 9th. But that's just my own soapbox. As I said on a tweet at some point this week, I was pretty ambivalent about the decision, and I thought it was a 50-50 call, and I've already spent way too much time talking about it. But so getting back to the sense of urgency, and really it's the sense of urgency at this point in the season that puts so much attention on a play like that, right? I mean, if the Cubs are out of it, maybe you shouldn't have bunted. Maybe it's a dumb call. Maybe it's a dumber call if they're way out of it, but still, who cares? Nobody's watching. But I like to get hung up on these games. I love that sense of the drama as the game goes. And I also tend to be one who stays up later than everybody else in my house. So if the Cubs play and I'm hanging out with family, we're having dinner, we're out doing something, kids have something, it's all good. I will just stay off Twitter, ignore the updates on my phone, and come home and fire the game up at 10 o'clock. It's great. I love watching those games. I wasn't doing that last year. Last year, as we're hanging out, I'm sort of tracking game day. This time last year, I was still running the podcast, so I still had to know what the Cubs were doing every day. I still had to know what people were talking about, but, I didn't have to invest that time. Now I want to. Meaningful baseball is fun. I said that last week, and I'm so happy right now that we have it. I mean, we'll see how long the Cubs stay in this race. I don't see any reason to assume they're going to drop out. I mean, I think the Cubs right now are better than the Reds are. I think they're better than the Brewers are. they're going to have to prove it on the field and get things done. And, there is something to the idea that, when you're playing catch up, you have to expend a lot of energy to get caught up. And the Cubs are close and they have reached the third spot in the wild card. They have not yet reached a tie for the division lead, but that can be coming. And I just want to see this team continue to play good, solid baseball, not overstress over a particular loss, not put undue importance on any one series. I mean, I came into this road trip hoping for 4-2, but 3-3 would be fine. I sort of was thinking it'd be the other way around, maybe win the Mets series 2-1 and then maybe lose the Toronto series 2-1. But it is what it is. I mean, it's fine. If the Cubs don't go out, they can't go out this weekend and get swept by Toronto. That would hurt a lot. I'm not going to say any individual game this weekend is a must win, but not getting swept is still not a must. I mean, there's still 7 weeks of baseball left. But, as I've said throughout the season, every opportunity you give away is something you're going to have to get later. So it's going to put more pressure on something down the line if they can't get things done this weekend. But I think, the Cubs are where they wanted to be. And I think one of the reasons they got here is I think there's been an increasing sense of urgency since the start of the season. I think when you look at the roster to start the season, there were some head-scratching decisions. I mean, Seiya Suzuki started on the injured list, and they only really went to opening day with 2 outfielders. They were trying to fill right field with a combination of Miles Mastrobuoni and Patrick Wisdom and Trey Mancini. Clearly didn't. I mean, the Cubs played okay ball in April, in April, but that certainly cost them some games. And they were carrying Edwin Rios, who hardly ever played, and the Cubs do like their third catchers, and they were carrying the third catcher in Luis Torrens. But again, he rarely played. And so there were just a lot of at-bats that, I guess I'll say, felt wasted. Now, I was always higher on Miles Mastrobuoni than a lot of you were, but, again, he didn't hit early in the season. He started to turn on in July, and I think looked really good. I saw he had a 400-plus foot home run to dead center last night to kind of set up an 8-run inning for the Iowa Cubs. But when on the whole, there have been a lot of players getting at bats that honestly probably shouldn't. I mean, when I look at the Cubs offensive stats and I look at on the whole season, they've had 4,430 plate appearances by Cubs hitters. I don't think it's any surprise that Nico Hoerner leads the way with 11% of those. Happ's second at 11%, but couple decimal points behind Nico Hoerner. Dansby Swanson's at 10%. He'd be a little bit higher, except he had the injury where he missed time. Seiya Suzuki's at 9%. Again, until recently when he hasn't been playing as much, he missed a month to start the season. Bellinger's at 8%. He missed a month in the middle. Christopher Morel, spent the first 6 weeks of the season or so in the minor leagues, and he's at 7% of their plate appearances. So it really, those are their top 6. And now with the addition of Candelario, who's way down in terms of the Cubs because he's only been here a few games. But those are the guys who carry the freight offensively. Tauchman now is up to 6%. And when you look at the guys who are, no longer with the team or no longer in Major League Baseball at all, no longer with the Major League team or no longer with the organization, 702 at-bats went to guys who just aren't around anymore. I mean, Trey Mancini leads the way with 263 plate appearances before he was let go. Miles Mastrobuoni at 113. He's now with AAA. Eric Hosmer got his 100 plate appearances before he was sent packing in favor of Matt Mervis, who got 99 plate appearances before he was sent down. And then you just had a bunch of stuff. Like Nelson Velasquez got 32. Edwin Rios got 34. Jared Young got 39. Just a lot of variability in the lineups, a lot of mixing and matching, trying to figure out how things go. Nick Madrigal has gone and Patrick Wisdom have gone back and forth between playing every day, platooning. They've both missed time with injuries. And so it's been kind of a bit of a roller coaster. But what's interesting now is if you look at, this sense of urgency. The Cubs have shown a willingness to get rid of guys. They moved on. Luis Torrens was a guy they liked out of spring training, and I understood sort of why they liked him. I never really understood why they carried him on the roster and didn't play him. That never really made sense to me. Kind of the same with Edwin Rios. But Rios had options. I understood Torrens making the team because he didn't have options. So if they liked him out of spring training and wanted to sort of give a shot and see what they saw, okay, fine. You're not going to carry him the whole season if he's not going to get done. And the Cubs wound up letting him go. The Cubs moved on from Eric Hosmer. He's making league minimum, so it was easy. But it was still, a veteran name they brought in and a guy that I think everybody liked in the clubhouse. And so maybe it wasn't the easiest of moves. And that continued. Edwin Rios has largely been in the minors. Again, like Rios too, like why wasn't he playing more just to see? But he hasn't done that well at Iowa either. He's now off the 40-man. He was outrighted to Iowa, I think, 30th of July. Nelson Velasquez got some shots. He came up and hit a huge grand slam and a comeback win over Seattle that was just epic. He's now been traded to Kansas City for Jose Cuas, who's putting up some meaningful innings in the bullpen. But you just have these guys that, the Cubs brought up, took a look, they saw something or didn't, and then moved on. And the fact that they, cut Jason Hayward last year, the fact they cut Trey Mancini this year, the fact that they've now recently benched Seiya Suzuki against right-handers, I think it's a sign that they're playing with more urgency than they were really at any time last year. And of course, because now they're in a pennant race and last year they weren't. What's interesting to me is I look at the lineups and Fangraphs, has a breakdown where you can kind of look at the lineups. They'll map out lineups day by day and you can just see where the colors don't change. And, one thing that really stands out is against right-handed pitching. Since he came up, Mike Tauchman has really consistently been the leadoff hitter. Since June 10th, he has led off 34 of 35 games against right-handed pitching. And today is going to be 35 out of 36. I've seen the lineup, the games tonight. And in every one of those 35 games where Mike Tauchman has been leadoff, Nico Hoerner's batted second. And in 19 of those games, Ian Happ has batted third. There was a stretch to start where Ian Happ was batting fourth and Seiya was third. But now this will be the 14th game in a row against a right-hander where Happ's batting third and Bellinger's batting cleanup. And the last 8 now have been Dansby Swanson at 5. So one of the things early in the season I think a lot of fans were frustrated by was just the constant churn in the lineup. You were seeing Gomes and Barnhart pretty well platoon. You were seeing a lot of Hosmer, a lot of Mancini, a lot of Wisdom, Madrigal, and it was just a constant kind of flux. When I look back at the first half of the season, kind of all games, it was pretty consistently Nico 1 and Dansby 2 for the first couple months of the season. Happ was mostly 3. But after that, it was really all over the place. Sometimes it'd be Bellinger, sometimes it'd be Mancini at 4, Suzuki, sometimes Wisdom at 4. We've seen Yan Gomes hit anywhere from 4 to 9. It just was kind of all over the board. And as the season's gone on, it's gotten more consistent. And that's something I think a lot of fans wanted to see. Like, just get something together and let guys know where they're going to be and let it kind of settle. And as they did that, the Cubs played better baseball. I don't think that is really all that shocking. Now, against lefties, the Cubs have been more inconsistent. Against lefties, we're pretty much seeing since May 19th, every game against the lefty has had Nico Hoerner lead off, except for the game against Max Fried last Friday against the Braves, when Hoerner got the day off and Madrigal led off. And then second through all those games was Dansby until mid-June. And then, it was a lot of Seiya Suzuki. And now lately, Seiya's been a little bit lower and been out a little bit more. Happ a lot of third. But you don't see a lot of consistency there. And I think it's a combo of both. I think they haven't had success, so they keep tinkering with the lineup. But also tinkering with the lineup could contribute to the lack of success. But I think it's clear that they're playing with more urgency, and we're seeing that in the pitching too. I mean, Drew Smiley getting assigned to the bullpen takes him out of the rotation. It means we're past the trade deadline. The Cubs are not going to pick up somebody from another organization unless somebody gets released or the Cubs claim somebody off waivers. And the odds of somebody outright releasing somebody who's better as a starting pitcher than Drew Smyly is pretty low at this point. If they do it, it's going to be somebody with a big contract attached. And I don't know if the Cubs would want to do that. And I think Tom Ricketts made it pretty clear during the trade deadline that money was there if Jed felt the need. And I think Jed, as much as he thinks the Cubs are building it on the way, I think this is not a year where he wants to burn going over the CBT, which, I can be critical of that to some degree. But there just isn't going to be help coming from another organization. So if you're taking Smyly out of the rotation, that means you're going to put some trust in some combination of Javier Assad, Hayden Wesneski, Caleb Killian is up now. We could potentially see Ben Brown when he comes back from the injured list, in AAA. But those are probably the guys. And I think Javier deserves it. He has been so good. He's been so consistent out of the pen. I mean, everybody has a bad outing here and there, but he's been such a welcome bit of relief in those days where the Cubs starter doesn't get through it. He has come in for Stroman a couple times lately, Smyly, and done a great job. So I'm looking forward to his start tonight. I know he's not fully stretched out because he's been more in a bullpen role, but I would love to see him be able to go 5 innings. And if he can go 5 innings and 5 pretty successful innings, the Cubs bullpen is a little bit rested right now. They, looking at the pitching usage over the last couple of weeks, probably the only one that's not available right now is maybe Jose Cuas. I mean, nobody played yesterday because they had the off day, but Cuas did throw 36 pitches in 2 innings on Wednesday. But everybody else, I mean, Merriweather threw Tuesday and Wednesday, but Wednesday he only threw 3 pitches and it was off yesterday. Daniel Palencia threw a really rough inning, 37 pitches on Monday, but now he hasn't pitched in 3 days. Caleb Killian hasn't pitched since Monday. Wesneski only threw 14 pitches Wednesday. I mean, so I think the bullpen's pretty fresh. So if Assad can get the Cubs through 5 and the Cubs can be in the game, I think the Cubs have the bullpen to get through it. One thing the Cubs are going to have to watch, though, in addition to the starting pitching, so now they're going to have to take somebody out of their pen or somebody out of the minor league system and put them in the rotation. And that's, it's the 5th starter. So across baseball, the 5th starter is not necessarily expected to go deep consistently. That's a guy you're hoping to get 5, maybe 6 innings from. If you can get a quality start, that's pretty much a win. But, when you look at the Cubs bullpen, then look at the Cubs bullpen usage, we've got Mark Leiter Jr. with 50 appearances. He's on pace for 70. Merriweather's got 50, again on pace for 70. Fulmer's at 49 appearances, on pace for 69, which would be nice for him. Alzolay has 44 appearances, on pace for 62. And for Leiter Jr., Merriweather, and Alzolay, they're already past their career high in appearances. So they're pitching well, and I hope they continue to go. But as these games get more urgent, and I know as more importance is placed on each and every individual game, it's going to feel to fans in the front office and the team and Ross that they're better off going to the higher leverage guys as often as possible. And David Ross is pretty clear about his circle of trust. Right now, his circle of trust is those 4 guys. Jose Cuas has thrown well, so he may find his way in there, and that may be a really important thing because the Cubs didn't add a lot at the deadline, but they did add Cuas, and he's looked pretty good. So if he can go in and take some of that load off, that'd be really helpful. If Drew Smyly can go in and, he's probably not going to take leverage innings, at least to start, but if he can go, he doesn't have great lefty splits. Like, he's not a guy who's, in the old days would have been the old loogie to come in and face, one left-hander and get them out. But if he can take some of those innings and maybe the 6th or the 7th where there are a couple left-handed hitters coming up, like, that could be really valuable. But, you kind of have to wonder how these guys are going to hold up. I'm optimistic. They're not showing signs of breaking down, but, when you've got 3 of those 4 guys already past their career high in volume, it can be a lot, especially as those games get more important. They're going to tend to be a little more amped up, maybe throw a little bit harder. So hopefully those guys can stick it through. It's going to be really important, especially if the Cubs can get Marcus Stroman back. Start to get through these dog days, get through the hottest days of the summer. If Justin Steele can continue to be consistent, if Marcus Stroman can get back to, he's not going to get back to being, career best probably. That 2-month stretch he had to start the season was probably the best stretch of his entire career. If he can get back to where he's consistently throwing 6 innings, occasionally going deeper, that's going to make a huge impact on this bullpen. And then as the Cubs continue to work on the offensive side, it's going to be important to get a couple of guys back, like Seiya and Happ, who maybe aren't as hot as they could be, have not been having the seasons we maybe expected from them. Seiya had a really nice game on Wednesday against the Mets. He went 3 for 4 at a homer and a triple. He really looked good. He was hitting the ball hard. 3 of his 4 balls were hit over 100 miles an hour. And he elevated. That's been kind of the biggest thing for him. He's notoriously picky at the plate, so he does get a lot of, his walks are up this year. His Ks are a little bit up, but not that much up from last year. But he just tends to work a lot of deep counts, and he does have a propensity this year to hit the ball more on the ground. Like his launch angles are not what they were last year, so he's had fewer barrels. He's not getting the sweet spot quite as often, but his hard hit rates are still pretty solid. I mean, if you look at Seiya Suzuki on StatCast, he's still 86th percentile average exit velocity, 94th percentile max exit velocity, 87th percentile hard hit percentage. A lot of the rest of his numbers, his barrels are down, whiff rates a little bit down, but it's still a pretty good whiff rate, 66th percentile. Still doesn't chase often, 91st percentile for chase rate, which sometimes for him leads to more called third strikes, which we've seen probably too much of this year. Good arm strength, good outfielder jump. He's played a pretty solid outfield this year, but on the whole, it's just not quite all come together. And I think his season has not been right from the start. But if the Cubs can get him back to anything close to what he was at the end of last year for this stretch run, that's going to be huge for this team. Because right now the Cubs have a lot of versatility. I talked about Mike Tauchman. Cody Del Mendo from the CHGO podcast has sort of tagged this is the summer of Mike Tauchman. And it has been. He's been great. He's a career journeyman, 4th outfielder kind of player. But he's just had consistent good at bat after good at bat after good at bat. He's playing a good center field. I'll never forget him with the walk-off game-saving home run robbery in St. Louis. He's really been spectacular. So, if Seiya's not going to hit, or if Ian Happ's not going to hit, Mike Tauchman can play center field. He can play right field. He can play left field. Cody Bellinger can play first base, or he can play center. Frankly, Cody won his Gold Glove in right field, so he can play other positions too. Jeimer Candelario has been great since the Cubs picked him up. He can play first base or third base. And it's been pretty wild, actually. He came over. He's played first base in his career, but he came over and the Cubs immediately put him in first base, and Ross said he was going to play a good amount of first base, and he's been borrowing Miguel Amaya's first base mitt because he didn't have one. But he's been doing a great job over there. It's given them some flexibility to play Nick Madrigal at third base, who Nick continues to hit pretty well. He's been in a bit of a slump lately, but on the whole, we've been seeing more of the Nick Madrigal we wanted to see than not. We'll see where that goes. But if he goes into any kind of extended slump, then it's easy enough to just put Candelario back at third, let Bellinger play more first base, and then you can fill the outfield with Tauchman, and especially if Seiya's hitting, you can certainly fill right field with Seiya. It bodes for the future. And one thing that's been interesting is the Cubs have opened up a couple 40-man spots. As the season goes, depending on the sense of urgency, they could go some really interesting directions with those last couple roster spots. Obviously, anybody who's on the 40-man could get a call up, but it does kind of pave the way that maybe we get to the end of August or early September and we add Pete Crow Armstrong to the 40-man roster, and he's probably not going to come up and play every day. That's at this point I would not put a rookie, with just a week or two of AAA time in to start center field in the middle of a playoff race over a red-hot Mike Tauchman and Cody Bellinger. But late in the season, maybe he becomes that 25th guy on your bench or 26th guy on your bench, and he's available as a defensive replacement. He's available to pinch run late in the game. You get a good matchup against a right-hander, and you want to put him in there and let him do his thing. It's a pretty cool opportunity to kind of energize the guys and give some guys a break. especially if some guys are slumping. They also have some options at pitcher. Ben Brown, when he comes off the injured list, he might be somebody that can bring up and help out in the bullpen. Caleb Killian is now up to help out in the bullpen. Depending on what they do and when Marcus Stroman comes back, I don't know if Assad keeps just staying in the Marcus Stroman spot in the rotation and then Stroman takes over Smiley's spot. Because at this point, once you're in season, you've got off days. It doesn't really matter 1 through 5. You can number it however you want. Steele right now is clearly the number 1. If Stroman's back healthy, he's number 2. You're probably calling Hendricks number 3. So on and so forth. But the question will be, what do they do with that last spot? I assume unless he struggles, Assad's going to get that rotation spot once Stroman's back. But, Hayden Wesneski is there as an option, and so is Killian. Both of those guys have been stretched out and pitched pretty well at Iowa. Killian, the biggest concern right now is kind of his swing and miss rate. He's not missing a lot of bats. He had good numbers in AAA, so if he's locating, and that's been his number 1 problem when he's been in the bigs, is location. He will throw strikes. It's not like he's walking everybody, but he just gets hammered. And the last time we saw him, he gave up, I want to say it might have been 5 runs in the first inning, wound up giving up 7 in 4 innings. Maybe it was 7 in the first. But in that game, I do recall that he really battled back well. He got hammered in the first inning, and the Cubs were at a point where they just needed him to get through 4 or 5 innings. He was just going to have to wear that one. And he really battled back, and he got his composure together, and he went out and he battled, and he pitched, I think, 2+. I can't remember if he finished all 3 innings, but he got into the 4th. Really battled back and threw some good pitches after that. If he's locating, he's a guy who can get some outs. So we'll see. I think I kind of like him in the bullpen role because he can kind of amp it up a little bit, amplifies his fastball a bit. He has quite a few pitches, so he can kind of pare it down to his whatever he's feeling best with that day. But as the Cubs get to these games and they're, in the race, things are going to matter more. I'm still not going to call very many games, absolute must wins, but every game takes on a little bit more importance. And tomorrow will be a little bit more important than today, and Sunday will be a little bit more important than tomorrow. And, at the end of the season, those games in mid-September are more important than the games in mid-August if you're still in the race. So they're going to have to keep continuing to build on this, and they're going to have to continue to show that if guys are struggling, that they're going to set egos aside and, drop a guy down in the order or take him out of the lineup for a couple days. And I think right now we've kind of seen that with everybody, except right now there are a lot of people calling for Ian Happ, and I get it. I can argue it kind of either way. I mean, I think the logic of having Happ third is that you've got Mike Tauchman or Nico Horner leading off, depending on whether it's right-handed or a left-hander. I could certainly argue that Mike Tauchman should continue to play against lefties. I'll tackle that one in a second. But for Ian Happ, he takes a lot of walks, and even when he's not hitting, his on-base percentage has still stayed pretty high. So I think there's a thought there that, if he's 3 and Bellinger's 4, the way Bellinger's been hitting, it gives Ian Happ a little protection in the 3 spot. Like, you can't just kind of ho-hum, okay, we walked Ian Happ, we'll get the next guy because the next guy's probably a better hitter. And on the flip side, if you've got Cody Bellinger coming up, you want him to come up with guys on base. And so Ian Happ gets on base enough, especially following, Horner or Tauchman and Horner, or Horner and whoever's batting second, that you want him coming up with guys on base. So putting Happ in front of Bellinger makes some sense. Happ has struggled lately with, runners in scoring position and kind of those high leverage moments. But on the season, if you go to Fangraphs and look at, leverage splits, his high leverage splits are better than his low and medium level splits. So on the whole, he's gotten it done. And it's not all walks either. I mean, he's got his highest batting average when you break it down by low leverage, medium leverage, and high leverage. His highest batting average is high leverage. His slugging percentage is probably highest in the medium leverage, but his batting average and on-base percentage are high on both. So on the whole, he's getting it done in key spots. We just certainly remember the ones where he doesn't, like Wednesday night. So the Cubs now hit into a stretch where they've got this series against Toronto. This is a good Toronto team. It's another team from the AL East, and Toronto is very much battling for position. They're playing pretty good ball right now. They've won 6 of their last 10, but they're not super hot. And it's a team that, they're going to give the Cubs a tough matchup. But we're in August playing meaningful baseball against good teams, so you're going to get tough matchups. So hopefully the Cubs can continue to do what they've done against a lot of these teams so far this year. They've won a lot of series against, good teams. This one's on the road. It's going to be a little tougher, but they beat New York 2 out of 3 before the All-Star break. And if they can at least get one, don't get swept, sort of salvage not the road trip you want it to be. But I think this team has shown that they'll battle. I think there's definitely a winning spirit in the clubhouse. You've seen Dansby Swanson talk about it. I mean, this team feels like they should be winning, and they are frankly doing a lot of the little things to win. They got to get back to scoring more runs, though. Then you come home, and then is the stretch to go make a run. I mean, they come home. They've got 2 next week against the White Sox, and then a day off before they start a weekend series against the Royals. The Royals have been playing good baseball lately, and Nelson Velasquez just got promoted, so good luck to Nelly in Kansas City, but that's not a great baseball team. Then they go on the road for 3 against Detroit and 4 against Pittsburgh. And the Cubs are not going to continue to win every game against Pittsburgh forever. So, I don't necessarily expect a 4-game sweep. But the Cubs have gotten it done against Pittsburgh this year. And, through that stretch, that's a 12-game stretch. They're not going to go 12-0. But there's probably no reason they can't go 8-4, 9-3, 10-2. So that's a time where they can get some stuff done. Then they've got a good division stretch with 3 against Milwaukee and 4 against Cincinnati. Add on, homestand against San Francisco and Arizona. And so they're going to bounce back and forth the rest of the way between, having a really light schedule and playing some weaker teams, and then having some really key series that are going to be big in the wild card race. I mean, the Cubs are trailing San Francisco in the wild card race, trailing Milwaukee in the division race. They're right there with Cincinnati in both. They've just recently passed Arizona in the wild card race, but Arizona's still around, at least at this point. And then you want to set yourself up because the last week of the season, depending on who's still in play and who's competing, if the Cubs are still in play for something, you don't know who else will be in play for buys or home field or whatever. But the Cubs end the season with a 6-game road trip in Atlanta and then to Milwaukee. So you're going to want to do a lot of damage and set yourself up well to maybe do some damage and maybe cinch something that last weekend. That's a long ways from now with a lot of baseball in between, but continue to watch. I think the theme right now is that sense of urgency. The Cubs have it. They need to play with it. It means that, I don't think the Cubs lacked urgency in New York. I think they just didn't play well and didn't execute. But I think this team is going to have to continue to step it up and continue to meet challenges. They're going to play some of these bad teams are not going to be the same team that was bad the first half of the season. Sometimes they're going to turn it over to some kids, and they might see some kids who get a spark. I mean, remember the Cubs had such a good second half run last year, behind pitching of Assad and Adrian Sampson and, some Brandon Hughes in the bullpens. Like some guys you hadn't really heard of were making a lot of noise. And the year before, the Cubs had a decent second half, at least for a while after they traded away Rizzo and Bryant and Baez, because it was, the Schwindy City. Schwindel, Rafael Ortega just kind of got hot when they got a chance to play. And so they're going to play some teams with those guys, and you just have to find a way. Like this Mets team that beat them 2 out of 3 this weekend, this is not the same Mets lineup that lined up early in the season and everybody expected to be, among the cream of the crop. You just have to line up and play the team that you're lined up against, and that's what the Cubs are going to have to do every day. And the number one thing they can do is continue to play consistent, good baseball. If they do that, they're going to be in this race for a really long time. They may not make the playoffs this year. I never predicted them to. I thought they had a shot. I predicted them at 83 wins, maybe potentially up to 85. I still kind of feel like that. We talked through the standings last week and kind of projected wins, and I think it's going to take 85, 86. I think some team with 85, 86 wins this year is probably sneaking in the playoffs. I could be wrong. That number could pop up to 86, 87. But if the Cubs can get in that 84, 85 win ballpark, I mean, they're going to be in the race down to the very end, as long as they can avoid, a big losing streak or a long stretch of inconsistent bad baseball. If they keep playing the way they've been playing, they're going to be in this race for a long time, and it's a lot of fun. So enjoy it. Let's see if the Cubs can do some damage in Toronto and then come home and hopefully take care of business against some weaker teams. Thanks. Thank you for listening today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating or a review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share the episode with a friend. Just a few seconds gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page, cubspsplus.patreon.com, to help support the show and keep it ad-free. As always, the music for this podcast is from Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!